Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to this second Folorunsho Al-Akija Distinguished Lecture on Religion and Public Life in Africa. My name is Wafai Fawzi, and I serve as the interim Oppenheimer Faculty Director at the Harvard Center for African Studies. I'm also a member of the faculty as Professor of Global Health, Epidemiology and Nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. The Center for African Studies offers Harvard a platform to learn from and further develop our strong collaborations with many partners around the continent and indeed around the world. At the core of everything, we seek to see that African voices and perspectives inform the scholarship here at Harvard and with our partner institutions. This virtual event is hosted by the Center for African Studies Africa office. Had we been able to meet in person, we would have hosted this event at our Africa office in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm glad that we are still able to convene virtually, and that perhaps allow even more people who wouldn't have had the chance to travel to join us. We're able to have our participants, distinguished guests, and audience from across the world join us today to discuss the challenges that the pandemic has brought into religious communities in Africa. The Folorunsho Al-Akija Distinguished Lecture on Religion and Public Life in Africa provides us a platform at the Center for African Studies to connect faith leaders and scholars with the Harvard community and beyond in a conversation about the constantly shifting and contested boundary between the secular and the sacred, the public and the private. We are really delighted to have Mrs. Al-Akija in attendance with us today. She is the Executive Vice Chairman of FAMFA Oil Limited and a member of the Center for African Studies Advisory Board. She is noted as Africa's most successful businesswoman with experience in fashion, oil, real estate, printing industries, to name just a few. She is also a generous philanthropist with her own foundation. We will have a chance to hear from Mrs. Al-Akija at the close of today's program. The Center for African Studies has a close relationship with the Harvard Divinity School. Indeed, faculty at the Divinity School, including Professors Jacob Olopuna, Usman Khan, Leila Ahmed, and Ali Asani, are faculty affiliates of our center, among other faculty at the school. The center has partnered with them on various initiatives. Just to name a couple, Professor Khan's initiative on Islam in Africa, and Professor Olopuna's Religion in the Public Sphere colloquium. It is our pleasure and honor to have with us this morning the Dean of Harvard Divinity School, who will provide welcoming remarks for the lecture. Dean David Hempton is the Alonzo L. McDonald Family Professor of Evangelical Theological Studies. He's also the John Lord O'Brien Professor of Divinity at the Divinity School. He has taught at Harvard since 2007 and was appointed as Dean of the Faculty in 2012. Prior to coming to Harvard, Dean Hempton was University Professor at Boston University. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, an Honorary Member of the Royal Irish Academy, and former Professor of Modern History and Director of the School of History in Queen's University of Belfast. Dean Hempton is a former chairman of the Wiles Trust. He has held fellowships from the Wolfson and Nuffield Foundations in the UK and the National Endowment of the Humanities in the US. He has lectured extensively in Europe, the US, and beyond, and delivered many sets of endowed lectures. His own teaching and research is actively involved around issues of religion and political culture, religious identities and ethnic conflicts, the interdisciplinary study of lived religion, the history and theology of evangelical Protestantism and Pentecostalism, the global history of Christianity since 1500, and religious disenchantment and secularization. Dean Hampton won many prestigious awards and honors for his teaching and his research. There are just too many to mention. He has published over 100 articles and book chapters and many books. In 2010, he was elected honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy. He's currently researching religion and its many interfaces with global modernities in preparation for the Gifford Lectures that he will deliver at Edinburgh in the spring of 2021. Please join me in welcoming Dean David Hampton.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. So I'm David Hampton, the Dean of the Harvard Divinity School, and I'm very honored to be with you today. On behalf of Harvard Divinity School and Harvard University, I welcome you all to this momentous and important gathering, the second Folaronso Alakajija Distinguished Lecture on Religion and Public Life in Africa. This year's lecture focuses on one of the world's most challenging crises in our time, the COVID-19 pandemic. As we consider the impact of this pandemic on the lives and livelihoods of many, many people, it seems appropriate also to discuss the place of religion in the public sphere in the light of this crisis. So we welcome Professor Simeon Ilasami, our distinguished lecturer for today's event, and Mrs. Folaronso Alakajija, a woman of faith in whose name this annual lecture was established last year. Thanks to both of you for honoring Harvard's invitation. Harvard Divinity School recently launched a new degree program in religion and public life, the first new degree program in its 50-year history. This new master's program aims to study the way religion and civil life intersect and provide students and practitioners of faith traditions an opportunity to explore how religious traditions and their adherents influence and interact with the public sphere and vice versa. So today's lecture on the legal regulation of faith in Africa fits very closely with the objectives of this new degree program. Our speaker and distinguished lecturer of the day is no stranger to Harvard, and we're especially glad to welcome him back to participate in this very important conversation. Lastly, I just want to say, and to seize this opportunity to reiterate the Divinity School's enthusiastic support of the African Studies program on the Harvard campus, and look forward to many future collaborations between our departments towards exciting endeavors such as this one. We are absolutely delighted to be in partnership with you. So thank you so much for the invitation to join with you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Dean Hampton. We are also really proud of the links that we have as a Center for African Studies with the Divinity School. We seek to bring all voices around Africa across campus with our partner institutions in Africa and beyond. And the engagement with the Divinity School and the faculty there is really a central element of that effort. So thank you so much again. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jacob Olupona, who has been integral to the programming of this lecture. He will introduce our keynote speaker and will also respond and moderate today's conversation. Jacob K. Olupona is Professor of African Religious Traditions, the Harvard Divinity School, and a Professor of African and African American Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Professor Olupona has been a member of the Center for African Studies Faculty Executive Committee since 2016. And we are indeed grateful to him for his collaboration on this lecture series, as well as his support of various elements of the center's work. He's also a faculty chair of the Weatherhead Research Cluster on Religion in Public Life in Africa and the African diaspora. Professor Olopona has studied at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and at Boston University, where he received his PhD in comparative religion in 1983. He has authored or edited numerous books and received many prestigious grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, the Ford Foundation, and many others. In 2012, Professor Olopona was named one of Harvard's Walter Channing Cabot Fellows for Distinguished Scholarship and received numerous awards and honors from Harvard and around the world. To name just a couple, in 2007, he received the Nigerian National Order of Merit, the country's highest award for intellectual accomplishment. And in 2015, he was honored with the Riemer Lust Award by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. Professor Olopona served on the editorial boards of several important journals and was the president of the African Association for the Study of Religion. He has recently finished his research on the phenomenal growth of evangelical Christianity in Nigeria. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jacob Olopona. Over to you, Jacob.
Thank you, Professor Wafai Fauzi, for the introduction. I'm very, very grateful. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Simeon Ilesami, who generously agreed to be our keynote speaker for the second Folorunsho Alakija Distinguished Lecture on Religion and Public Life in Africa. Professor Ilesami is the Washington M. Wingate Professor and convener for the MA, the JD program in Religious Studies, the dual degree program at Wake Forest University. His numerous publications include Religious Pluralism and the Nigerian State, The Rule of Law and the Rule of God, journal and law review articles, and book chapters on topics that reflect his brand research interest in comparative ethics, just war theory, human rights, and the intersections of law, religion, and ethics. He had been a Lawrence Rockefeller Visiting Fellow at Princeton University, a member of Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, and a faculty fellow of Aspen Institute. He serves on the editorial boards of several academic journals. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ilesami to Harvard University.
Allow me to begin my presentation by thanking the benefactor whose generosity endowed this distinguished annual lecture and made today's event possible. Mrs. Folorunsho Alakija, who is also a very good friend of this university. Thank you for your vision and the very many noble ways in which you have chosen to impact not just your immediate society, but the global academy. I also want to express my sincere thanks to faculty colleagues at Harvard, one of whom has been a mentor since my undergraduate days at IFE. I thank Professor Wafai Faiz Interim Oppenheim Faculty Director of the Center of African Studies. Professor David Hempton, Dean of Harvard Divinity School. Professor Jacob Olupono, Professor of African and African American Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Professor of African Religious Traditions at Harvard Divinity School. All of them were instrumental in selecting and inviting me as this year's speaker. Allow me also to thank one of the respondents to my presentation, Professor Elizabeth Foster from Tufts University. Finally, I thank Alex Taylor, Executive Director of the Center for African Studies here at Harvard, and Itatsi Kwela, the Program Manager of the Center for African Studies, for handling the logistics for today's event. I'm deeply grateful to all of you. As many families across the world are running for cover from coronavirus disease 2019 since its outbreak earlier this year, the various measures governments took to respond to it have reignited vigorous debate in both scholarly and public circles about the proper relationship between the state and religion in all its variegated expressions. This is especially so in Africa, where the state projects itself as the guardian of secular morality and its justifying norms of neutrality, impartiality, and equality, while religion confidently grants its legitimacy and importance in the informal domain of culture, where putative spiritual precepts combine with inherited local traditions to shield the people against the perceived excesses of modern political orthodoxy. Any assessment of the regulatory responses of African governments to the threats posed by COVID-19 must begin with an acknowledgement of these perennial tensions between the continent's two powerful institutions, the secular state and religion. At the heart of these tensions are three key issues. First is the invocation of the role that religion and religious institutions played in the emergence and formation of modern African states as a template for articulating their contemporary relevance. Second is the ethical ambiguity that religious institutions and groups display in how they understand and should exercise their social responsibility. And finally, the indeterminate nature of the official status of religion in the laws of many African countries. On the first issue, there is no denying the fact that religious institutions contributed significantly to the two major sectors that constitute the indicia of modernity in Africa, namely education and health. This partly explains why these institutions continue to have the kind of high profile associated with them on the continent. It is common knowledge that majority of the first generation of African elites, especially those involved in the anti-colonial nationalist movements, were products of schools established by religious institutions, especially Christian. Similarly, hospitals and health clinics founded by these institutions have historically outpaced the ones established by the governments in both quality and number. Thus, religious groups see and understand themselves, and for good reasons, to be forces for good in the society. Yet, any casual observer of African affairs know that there are reasons to be concerned about religious high visibility on the continent. News about religious activities are not always salutary, but rather about violence and destruction that exact grave toll on both human lives and property. While we do not need to cite any specific examples to illustrate this point, it is not inaccurate to assert that no part of Africa is immune to the horrors that mismanaged religious sensibilities can unleash on the society. The industry of religion may be growing much faster in Africa than in any other parts of the world. Not everyone considers this social phenomenon as an achievement to be celebrated. In fact, many blame it for the perceived fragility and precariousness of many African polities. Even if the blame seems unfair or the actual role of religion in the non-hotspots is exaggerated, no one can deny its saliency as an explanatory factor for many of Africa's avoidable travails. This dual legacy and the ambivalent character of religion cannot be ignored in reviewing government's decision to include it among the areas of life to be regulated in the face of the challenges presented by COVID-19. Religious communities themselves are cognizant of this reality of ambivalence, as it characterizes not only their cultural identity, but also their conceptions of social justice and the welfare programs they sometimes design to enact those visions. As it has been shown during this COVID-19 period, religious communities have vacillated between supporting and thwarting or obstructing government ameliorative and palliative efforts. Of course, history reveals that there is nothing necessarily wrong when communities of faith cooperate with secular institutions, especially when doing so has the purpose and effect of serving people in need. Such disposition typically arises out of a sense of responsibility to the society in which these communities exist and operate, which in turn may be connected to deep theological convictions that they have to bear witness to the integrity of their commitments through the concrete impact they are able to make on people's lives and social structures. After all, one of the primordial obligations that Christians, for example, believe that human beings were given at the dawn of creation is to cultivate and keep the earth. The two Hebrew words used in this context are abad and shamar. The former can be translated as work, nurture, care for, and protect. These are active verbs that convey God's intention that human beings both develop and cherish the world in ways that meet human needs and bring glory and honor to Him. In the Christian view, then, human beings are by divine intent and their very nature world makers and world changers. The passion to engage the world, to shape it and finally change it for the better is supposed to be an enduring mark of Christians on the world in which they live. To be Christian is to be obliged to engage the world, pursuing God's restorative purposes over all of life, individual and corporate, public and private. This, Christians believe, is the mandate of creation. And similar beliefs are found in Islam and in the various embodiments of the traditional religions. And in that respect, the religious communities in Africa or elsewhere are like other civil society organizations that are interested in having influence on broad segments of the public beyond their primary constituencies. As laudable as the desire to be socially relevant is, it is not the sole constitutive feature of the moral outlook of religious communities. they are also bearers of a corrective vision for the political life. Even when they feel impelled to cooperate with the government to address a common social problem such as COVID-19, they may still reserve the prerogative to challenge or criticize the adopted mode of fashioning and implementing the solutions, a tendency that the government sometimes finds irritating or even unpatriotic. The genius of religious traditions consists in their ability to maintain this prophetic and critical stance. It is what distinguishes them from conventional civil society organizations. A mandate they can either exercise interpretively when they attempt to offer theological diagnosis and explanations of social crises that are different from the official accounts proffered by governments, or programmatically when they refuse to put their spiritual stamp on the government's proposed solutions to those crises. In either respect, the aim of prophetic critique is to encourage governments to broaden their understanding of existing crises and be open to the wisdom of unorthodox approaches to solving them. While hostility and confrontation are not the reasons of prophetic critique, they may erupt if the critique is not wisely expressed or if governments misconstrues the critique as a recipe for civil chaos and avoidable disaster. How have these competing and complementary dispositions of religious communities play out in the context of government regulatory responses to COVID-19 in Africa? Let us briefly examine this question. To understand the basis of and rationale for government's regulations of religious behaviors and activities as part of the comprehensive efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19, we have to turn briefly to some relevant provisions of both national laws and international legal instruments. A starting point is Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which guarantees freedom of religion, but also allows governments to narrowly restrict religious freedom by law when necessary to protect a legitimate state interest, including public health. Another is the Siracusa Principles on the limitation and derogation provisions of the ICCPR, which explains that public health measures that limits must be specifically aimed at preventing disease or injury or providing care for the sick and injured. Because many African countries are signatories to the ICCPR, their laws reflect the language of this international covenant regarding both the scope and limit of religious freedom. For example, South Africa's Disaster and Management Act of 2002 gives the relevant minister the power to limit certain rights and freedoms by declaring a state of disaster when he or she determines that there is the presence of a disaster. The act defines a disaster as a progressive or sudden, widespread or localized, natural or human-caused occurrence, which or threatens to cause death, injury, or disease, damage to property, infrastructure, or the environment, or disruption of the life of a community. Pursuant to this act, the country's Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs announced on March 23rd, 2020, a series of restrictions including on freedom of movement and assembly, initially prohibiting all gatherings, such as for prayers, excepting for funerals that were limited to 50 individuals. The regulation also states that anyone who is suspected of having COVID-19 or has been in contact with a person who has tested positive for COVID-19 cannot refuse testing. If confirmed positive, the individual cannot refuse treatment, isolation, or quarantine. Failure to comply may result in imprisonment, not exceeding 12 years, a fine, or both. Similarly, the rights to religious expression, both individually and corporately, as well as of freedom of movement, which are provided for respectively in sections 38 and 41 of the Nigerian Constitution, are subject to the exigency of public order, health, and safety, which when threatened, obligates the government to impose limitations in a way that is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. The Nigerian government invoked the power of these provisions to declare COVID-19 a public emergency and put in place the following measures. Number one, intensive surveillance and case finding, which focuses on identifying, characterizing, and responding to community transmission of COVID-19. Two, public health and social measures that include shutting of borders, introduced self-isolation for exposed persons, including nationwide lockdown, established centers for quarantine of cases, all designed to flatten the rate of transmission. Innovative use of technology and new ways of working in health and other non-health sectors. Encourages citizens to use face masks. Frequent hand washing in running water with soap and hand sanitizers. Limiting gatherings in public and religious houses of worship to a range of 20 to 50 people, and maintenance of social distancing when such gatherings are necessary. These are examples of broad powers that many legal systems around the world vest in the states to exercise during outbreaks and other public health emergencies. They may place restrictions on movement, quarantine persons, mandate vaccinations against infectious agents, and limit public gatherings to prevent the spread of disease. For instance, under the United States law, the federal government may burden religious practice when it enacts a neutral and generally applicable regulation, order, or law. The US Supreme Court made this clear when it upheld, in a case titled Employment Division v. Smith, the denial of unemployment benefits for a Native American who ingested a peyote as part of his religious sacrament. The loss of benefits burden him uniquely, but to push aside the law for the religious belief will make a religious believers a law unto themselves. That was how the late Justice Scalia argued. After this case, Congress imposed on the federal government the duty to show more when burdening religion with federal laws. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, known by the acronym RFRA, allows a person whose religion is burdened to ask a court to test whether that burden is necessary. The government must show a compelling interest for its actions that the government cannot satisfy with less restrictive means. Many states in the United States have similar state constitutional protections or state reference, policing religious burdens that flow from laws that are neutral and generally applicable. Essentially, this means that judges must interrogate the need for restricting the people's movement during a pandemic. Given the extraordinary risk of transmission of the coronavirus, together with COVID-19 lethality, finding a compelling interest in limiting gatherings to 10 people or less, or to making citizens shelter in place seems fairly straightforward, or so it seems. However, this is not how many religious communities saw these restrictive measures. What were their reasons? Why did they find it difficult to initially cooperate with their country's governments? How should religious communities respond to public health emergencies regulations? In both South Africa and Nigeria, as well as in most of Africa, people have historically looked more to religious authorities than to government officials for guidance on how to behave and what to believe, especially in a crisis. This is a fact that governments know too well, which was why they sought to leverage the trust, reach, and practical support of religious leaders to deliver effective public health responses to COVID-19 challenge. Generally speaking, national, regional, and local religious leaders have high levels of influence and community organizing capabilities and are able to frame approaches that will facilitate the success of government programs. They are also able to lend their reputation and communications reach to governments to support behavior change and compliance with the enacted restrictions and other mitigating measures. As can be expected, religious communities do their best to preserve this cultural and moral capital unless they have good reasons to hold it in abeyance. A recent study on the attitudes of religious bodies toward government regulations in 3 Southern African countries, that include South Africa, Botswana, and Swaziland, shows a broad acceptance of these restrictions. In reported interviews, religious adherents from different religious backgrounds justifies their deference to the government's restrictive measures on the ground that the measures were not arbitrary. Rather, they were necessary because of the extraordinary and abnormal nature of the COVID-19 circumstances. They claimed the responsible thing to do in this situation is to adhere to the government regulations, adapt to new situations as they arise, and become innovative so as to make the lockdown worthwhile without negatively impacting any member of the congregation, physically, mentally, socially, technologically, and spiritually. Many religious communities also want to demonstrate to their governments that despite the disruptions to some of their religious vocational life and values, they remain law-abiding citizens and residents. The same can be said of what initially took place in other African countries, especially Nigeria, where churches and mosques adjusted their time of services, reduced the number of worshipers to between 20 to 50 per service, and eventually moved their services to virtual platform. However, as it became clear that the pandemic was not going to be short-lived, the will to comply fully with the government directives started to wane. The reasons were both cultural and economic. The pressures from culture may seem mundane to outsiders, but to the people defined and shaped by the culture, the reasons are not trivial at all. Relevant here is the value that Africans ascribe to vibrancy and active life as markers of a meaningful existence. Thus, milestone events, notably weddings and funerals of elderly parents, are characteristically festive rites to be celebrated with pomp and pageantry. Within this cultural ambience, there is a limit to how long people can endure boredom, with a sense of isolation and prescribed social distancing that fuels it as an adequate replacement value. It explains why people progressively relapsed to their pre-COVID-19 ways of life. Another reason, perhaps more important than the cultural factor, was economic and financial. Given the fact that most economic activities in Africa take place in the informal sector, few people have the luxury of working from home. And with little or no relief assistance from their governments, a protracted lockdown seems like a cruel and unusual punishment for many African people, majority of whom live considerably below the global poverty level. Nowhere was the financial hardship resulting from the lockdown more acute than among religious communities, which typically rely on their members' regular attendance of their services as avenues for generating revenues to fund many of the welfare programs that in turn benefit the members and the larger society. As observed by a Nigerian political scientist, Jibrin Ibrahim, the question on the mind of many Nigerians is clear. Should I remain indoors and die of hunger, or go out to look for food and maybe die of COVID-19? With the median age in Nigeria just 18, Ibrahim notes that the most important contemporary problem for Nigeria is the lack of opportunity for the youth. We have developed a huge youth bulge, he argues. This is happening at a time in which formal opportunities for employment are declining, and most industries have closed. Having a job has become a minority experience for Nigerians, and opportunities only exist in the informal sector. And the same can be said of many African countries. We know there are echoes of this economic apprehension in other parts of the world, especially here in the United States, where disagreement about how to rank the need to protect people from dying of COVID-19 and the need to protect people from losing their jobs became one of the defining issues of 2020 presidential election. How to strike a similar balance was also part of public debate all over Africa. Some people were worried that restrictions on their movement will only make already bad situations worse. They point out how COVID-19 and the lockdown it necessitated have not only exposed the fragility of the economy of African countries, but also of the wide gap between the rich and the poor. They criticize government's responses to COVID-19 as being blatantly discriminatory because those responses prioritize urban population over citizens in rural areas, as health facilities are concentrated in urban centers. When we reviewed what happened in Nigeria, the criticism is not entirely without merit, as the government did not take the pandemic seriously until some high-profile people became infected and died from it. What this suggests to us is that the coronavirus is much more than a public health emergency. It is a test of the whole architecture of governance. To quote Ibrahim again, we must govern ourselves out of the crisis. We could take another approach and see this crisis as leading us to build a more inclusive society in which the interests of all are what determine public policy choices. Another observer agrees with Ibrahim by arguing that the COVID-19 is an opportunity for African countries to reform their economic model. The future economy should be one that is anchored on inclusive growth, which recognizes the place of the informal sector as a key center for economic activity. Now is a moment to diversify and reposition African economy to be more productive for its ordinary citizens. While not denying the adverse economic effects of COVID-19 induced lockdown, other religious and human rights spokespersons direct attention to different implications of the government's regulations. In certain quarters, the worry is that Africa is not a political environment where governments can be given a blank check in respect to restricting people's freedom. This is because even before and without coronavirus, African governments are not known to be friendly with human rights. Moral vigilance is thus required to ensure that they do not exploit a public health emergency to strengthen their illiberal, intolerant, and anti-democratic proclivities. One form this vigilance has taken is in the interpretations of the pandemic that some religious leaders have given. To these leaders, government regulations only focus on the symptoms and not the roots of Africa's real crisis, which they say are spiritual and moral. Differently put, COVID-19 is a symptom of, or rather a divine punishment for, the society's moral and spiritual decay. Accordingly, the practical question of how to curtail the spread of the virus must be preceded by a theological introspection about what it means and what it signifies. The president of the Christian Association of Nigeria speaks for many of his ilk when he proffers what is essentially a retributive theory of COVID-19, declaring, and I quote him, "We have sinned against God, and he has sent to our midst a fiery serpent." According to him, it is the arrogance of man against God and lawfully constituted authority that led to God's anger and judgment over the people. People say anything today against God and the word of God. The Holy Scripture's injunctions, which are God's commands, no longer matter before us. All practices that will make us worship God, we reject or abandon under the guise of fundamental human rights. In some advanced countries, he continues, anything about God must not be mentioned in any public event. Neither can people worship God nor share the gospel with their neighbors. Doing so is an offense. This pride and arrogance against God came because of advancement in technology. We feel we can do many things without God and thus become God to ourselves, end of quote. He was not alone in holding this belief. Another commentator suggests that God has allowed COVID-19 to afflict the human race only to redirect our steps back to Him. We have so distorted God's word to suit our own human weaknesses and satisfy our greed, even in supposed holy places. Therefore, we should collectively ask for forgiveness, and it will all end in praise. If retribution seems too harsh, an interpretation of COVID-19, others put a more attractive spin on it by suggesting that its theological meaning is to remind people, especially religious people, that God does not reside in buildings, but in the human heart, which is the safest place on earth. In other words, religious people should not complain or bemoan government's regulations that limited their freedom of movement and freedom to assemble in religious houses of worship. Rather, they should welcome the restriction as an opportunity to rethink their bodies and hearts as sacred spaces where the divine can not only be worshipped, but reside in as permanent habitation. Moreover, this human-centered reconfiguration of sacred space has ancillary ecological benefits, another person suggests. The author of the universe, he argues, devised COVID-19 to slow humanity down and stem the tide of human destruction of the environment. Already, according to him, greenhouse gases have reduced, industrial chemical inflow into rivers and seas have been stemmed. Think about the future tsunami, floods, typhoons, earthquakes, and other extreme weather phenomena that will be prevented by this act of resting and rebooting Earth and the lives saved. Even the potential of COVID-19 to benefit and strengthen human relationships, including marriages, is not an outlandish thought, according to this line of reasoning. And here lies the great paradox about this much dreaded virus. According to one person, he argues, people are now spending time with their families instead of at work. Marriages on the verge of breakdown are now being repaired. More people are praying. Leaders are connecting with the led, all because of coronavirus. A few years from now, we will say to Satan, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. End of quote. As scholars, one needs not agree with this spiritualized interpretation of COVID-19 in order to appreciate the larger point they seem to be making. Namely, that religious traditions have the resources and capacity to set before our ordinary life an aspiration in contrast to which our everyday associations are too often found wanting. They are capable of engendering an understanding of our response to critical issues in our common life. In the spirit of the theme of this annual Folorunsho Alakija Distinguished Lecture, I want to devote the remainder of my talk to exploring some of the ways in which religious communities in Africa can guide public deliberations in the quest for responsible and constructive action during this stressful time. We all know that public health is best promoted when citizens voluntarily follow preventive measures without government coercion. Wearing a face mask or modifying when and where one worships is a case in point. Some people resent government-mandated face masking and social distancing in religious gatherings as intervention by a paternalistic government into a citizen's private life, or unwarranted regulation by a nanny state of the corporate life of a constitutionally protected voluntary association. As important as the language of human rights is to how we understand and organize our lives in this modern and postmodern age, I want to suggest that for most religious traditions, especially the indigenous African religions, the dominant orienting language is not human right, but human duty or human responsibility. We would do well to reacquaint ourselves with this second linguistic pillar of our modern heritage and explore its implications and potential for rejuvenating our public life. This may require that Africans also engage in some serious rethinking about how to contextualize and indigenize the norms of constitutional democracy that is gradually becoming a universal measure of political maturity. In Western liberal societies, many embrace the two key theses of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. The first thesis says our conduct can be divided into self-regarding and other-regarding acts, while the second thesis says other-regarding actions are to be regulated by the principle of harm, self-regarding actions. The part which merely concerns oneself, one's independence is of right absolute. Over oneself, over one's body and mind, the individual is sovereign. So argued John Stuart Mill. According to this way of thinking, risky behavior in the middle of a pandemic, such as going to a crowded religious gathering, church or mosque, without face masking, is self-regarding and so should be completely free of regulation. Mandatory face masking or social distancing is considered an aggressive and dangerous extension of automobile seatbelt and motorcycle helmet legislation. Unlike Western liberal individualism, which sees the self as separate, disconnected, and atomistic, African worldview sees the self as relational and dependent. Each relationship in the family, neighborhood, community, and society at large contributes to the development of the overall constitution and identity of the self. Personal freedom and individuality are always balanced by family and community, and these in turn are balanced by natural and supernatural powers. Every person is a center of relationships between the self, the world, and the invisible powers that influence and are influenced by a person's behavior. The moral ideal in Africa is the harmonious integration of the self with society and the spiritual world. Some African scholars have translated this moral norm, known in Yoruba as Ewa, among the Dinka as seeing the supreme virtue humans should cultivate as co-humanity or good human relations or ideal of social togetherness. As the Kenyan scholar, the late Professor Mbiti argued, I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. Other African scholars of religion, like late Professor Ibi Idowu and Professor Lukon and several others, will agree with this sentiment. Instead of stressing individual independence, African worldview emphasizes interdependence. Whatever affects me will affect whoever is connected with me. On this account of personhood, the distinction between self-regarding and other-regarding conduct is fuzzier than Mill and his defenders will admit, especially in health crisis. From this ethical perspective of African worldview, Risky behavior does not affect me alone. It affects all significant others with whom I have contact. In the time of COVID-19, risky behavior affects the entire community, especially healthcare workers. Drawing on the teachings of his faith tradition, the Sultan of Sokoto, Nigeria, His Excellency Muhammad Abubakar, argues that this principle of interdependence is also a touchstone of Islamic religion. He criticized fellow Muslims, especially the clerics, who are invoking the constitutional language of rights to freedom, to religious freedom, to preach non-compliance with government's public health directives, accusing them of myopic worldview and stark ignorance of reality, which can have serious adverse health implications for innocent people. He argues that basing the decision on how to respond to a pandemic on whims instead of knowledge is a clear departure from the Quran, which enjoins believers in Surah 16, verse 43, to ask those who know if you know not. The Sultan further asserts that Prophet Muhammad himself had advocated for the contemporary version of social distancing during times of disease, when he suggested leaving the town and hiding on mountains and in caves, suspending congregational prayers and Juma Friday prayers temporarily. In short, Muslims as citizens have a religious duty to prevent the spread of disease. In conclusion, while it is legitimate to ask in a time like this, how far can a government limit religious freedom in the name of fighting COVID-19? Perhaps a more urgent question to reflect on is, what obligations do religious adherents have to fight COVID-19 as a consequence of their right to religious freedom? The fact that African countries have been lucky not to have experienced the Armageddon that the world had feared at the onset of COVID-19 does not diminish the necessity to prioritize the language of obligations and responsibilities over that of individual or personal rights during this extraordinarily challenging time. Yes, religious gatherings are important opportunities for people to practice and share their beliefs, but they are also sites for transmission of COVID-19, engendering not only participants in these gatherings, but everyone with whom they interact. Although governments often use times of crisis to encroach on individual and collective freedoms, or to target minority groups long after the crisis has passed, COVID-19 is a kind of crisis that requires decisive government action. It is a crisis that cautions against an irresponsible reliance upon the notion of rights to peddle in messianic and apocalyptic messages, downplay the value of official public health guidance, and offer religious solutions that may run counter to good public health practice. Now is not the time to stand on our personal rights. It is not the time to think dogmatically or act defiantly in the name of religious freedom. Instead, it is a time to lead by example. And here are a few ways that African communities of faith can lead by examples. They can help track and address exclusionary and discriminatory patterns by ensuring that access to tests and treatment is not based on economic status, party affiliations, ethnic considerations, or parochial reasons. They can encourage governments not only to increase financial assistance and benefits to people who have been adversely affected by COVID-19, but also provide guidance on how this assistance can be fairly and equitably distributed. They can support widespread testing and tracing. They can help fundraise to cover people's testing and treatment. They can use their platforms to appeal to landlords and property owners and utility companies not to evict and or cut off services due to inability to pay. They can draw on the religious theme of forgiveness to focus attention on the impact of COVID-19 on the prison population. For example, by ensuring that prison inmates have access to testing, appeal to government to consider clemency and even home confinement for non-violent offenders. To be sure, this list is not exhaustive. And I'm sure you will agree with me that faith communities have the theological resources and capacious moral imagination to broaden the scope and intensity of their social impact in ways that are meaningful, constructive, and transformative. After all, from the perspective of indigenous African spirituality, the fundamental obligation of religious life is to struggle to form new worlds, to change lives, to give voice to the hope that surrounds life, and thus, in all things, to engage in the great and enduring task of civilization. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Ilesami, for this very rich and comprehensive lecture. The central thesis, the constant tension between religious institutions and the secular state, appears in three identifiable ways. The role religion played in the formation of the state, beginning this entanglement, ethical ambiguity in exercising social responsibility and religious performance, an unclear picture of where religion stands in state matters in most African nations. Permit me to respond to your presentation. Religion and the state. This complementarity and competition is indeed unique to Africa, because the separation of church and state globally doesn't function in quite the same way as it does here. As such, religion's high visibility in the continent has always been a double-edged sword, even in times of rest and prosperity. With regards to COVID-19, the impact of the virus hit the continent hard at first because of some religious narratives that disputed the very existence of the disease. This is the kind of nuisance, that religious civil action can cause. The industry of religion itself, as Professor Ilesami puts it, normally strive on everything that COVID-19 threatens. Mass gatherings were no longer possible. Education institutions had to be shut down. Hospitals and clinics were the only religious civics actions still functioning. In some cases, smaller hospitals had to be closed down to concentrate most cases within the government control and under quarantine protocols. And even those had to be placed under government mandate. Theological directives to subdue the earth had to be demoted to the personal prayer closet and social media broadcast to ameliorate the gap. Where government mandate was ignored, people were irresponsibly exposed to the illness. government response to COVID and legal regulation. With regards to legal regulation, sadly, this could not only be maintained for so long in African countries. Some countries came out of lockdown as soon as 1 month into it or less. Tanzanians, Magufuli actually refused to go into lockdown completely. Economies suffered greatly during the lockdown, forcing government hands in a way to reopen the country with regulations on movements and gathering. This, of course, has its own implications. Government corruption was at an all-time high in some states, with aid money quickly being siphoned off into the unscrupulous characters when the epidemic is still active. The imposed curfews resulted in use of excessive force and police brutality against civilians who did not comply with rules for early lockdown and gathering, which is sad because a pandemic only further exposes the instability of the social structures and weaknesses of government institutions for African states. Religious response to government regulation. I agree with Professor Ilesanmi that many congregations saw COVID-19 as a divine timeout, reset of some sort, and God's need to restore human damage done to the earth. This is harmful theology, of course, because it casts aside those who have died of the disease as consequences for the earth's wrongdoing. However, in thinking about doctrinal providence, I would say the latter is problematic because sickness and disease is arbitrary. But I suppose they have to say something to justify the uncertainty of such times. Also, as some marriages are being repaired, some are breaking down. I think especially about situations where victims of abusive relationships are now in lockdown with their abusers. We know where to go. It's good for religious leaders to see the positive side of things and communicate it to their congregation. But I wonder how much of it also shades the reality of the issue too optimistically and prevents people from making the necessary adjustments to curb the pandemic and to restore balance in their lives, which is why the next section is very important. Religion and public life. I think a big question that remains is how has the pandemic forced African governments to rethink social responsibility and constitutional freedoms differently? In terms of human relationship, the social struggle has been more about containing the spread of the disease, while also protecting the rights of vulnerable populations, like the elderly and the chronically ill, who suffer greater risk of contracting the virus, and children who, being away from school, may suffer from lack of proper supervision during the day, leaving them susceptible to sexual predators and other unsavory types, and in some instances, to food insecurity due to financial constraints on families at this time. So in terms of responsibility from one person to another, what does it mean to care for each other's well-being, and for the state to care for the citizens' welfare. I agree with Professor Ilesami that the rural areas and those on the margins are the hardest hit and yet remain excluded from government's effort to control the disease, despite federal governments in place and places like Kenya and Nigeria. In the urban areas, which are more visible and where government is better equipped infrastructurally to manage the impact of the disease and also the rates of infection, there has been more government intervention. But this too indicts the government's distribution of resources across the country because it is not considered equally, nor is it implemented justly. I was struck by Professor Ilesami's writings, and I want to quote part of it, that for most religious institutions, especially the indigenous African religions, the dominant orienting language is not human rights, but human duty or human responsibility. He mentions the need to, I quote, reacquaint ourselves with this second linguistic pillar of our modern heritage, and writes that this may require that Africans also engage in some serious rethinking about how to contextualize and indigenize the norms of constitutional democracy that is gradually becoming a universal measure of political maturity. This is very important, and it goes beyond even the contemporary problems we're dealing with. This is a key issue that really affects African lives and African culture. And this brought to mind some videos that were circulating from Nigeria in the first months of the pandemic, when the Federal Capital Territory Administration, called the FCTA, had started enforcing church and mosque shutdowns. In the videos, which became globally famous, the FCTA representative quoted the Bible, speaking conversantly in scripture to justify the right of the government to shut down the church and the duty of the congregation to obey government orders. The videos were famous, I think, because this man, this government agent, spoke in the language of the church to justify that the congregants followed the law. As awkward and unsophisticated as the videos may be, I think this was an apt example, actually, of what Professor Ilesami discussed: the power and effectiveness of indigenizing the language of human duty, human responsibility, contextualizing the limits of freedom in a language and using reference points that people understand and can accept. In this case, the FCTA representative was able to give religious grounding to his directives. Thus, he was able to persuade people to obey without force. In one of the videos, the pastor is even nodding his head as the FCTA representative quotes scripture to him on what he has done wrong. In this case, by meeting people on their terrain, speaking to them in a manner and in a context that has authority to them, emphasizing their duties, obligations, and responsibilities as people of faith, government authorities were able to persuade. So too, can others give religious and cultural grounding to directives to obey God's restrictions? Overall thought. I appreciated this wide lens approach to this very loaded topic because there is so much to say where it comes to state management of crisis and disaster like the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. I'm aware and I know that only very few scholars can do the kinds of balancing act that we just saw in Professor Ilesami's presentation. COVID-19 will definitely not be the last global health crisis if history is to be taken seriously, and the general progression of public health trends are to be believed. I guess the even bigger question for us now is how African government can prepare themselves adequately for crises like this in the future. I constantly hear Africans saying to us anytime there's a disaster somewhere, oh, thank God it's not here, because we do not have the machineries, the structures, and even the type of government to cope with this crisis. Outside of conflict and war, African states normally have not been able to manage large national scale crises like this very well. Thankfully, we don't have many natural disasters, like I said, and help from international aid agencies and local philanthropies, such as Mrs. Alakija's Foundation, often alleviate the more extreme cases of disaster on the continent. Definitely, majority of interventions that can augment government assistance will depend greatly on infrastructural improvement to cushion the impact of large-scale hits on education, health, and the economy. The latter will, of course, mean better management of national funds overall and increased structuralizing of institutional authority to curb the more common statewide disasters and to improve the ability to respond to such issues. This will be quite difficult given the extreme poverty and institutional corruption rife in most African states, but is something pragmatic that civics institutions can perhaps contribute to in collaboration with state leadership, and is perhaps more gradual than instantaneous. So thank you very much again to Professor Ilesami for this very, very insightful and substantial contribution to a major issue of our time. And now permit me to introduce our colleague and friends from Tufts University, who will be presenting the second response to this lecture. Elizabeth A. Foster is Associate Professor of History at Tufts University. She is the author of African Catholic, Decolonization, and the Transformation of the Church, published by Harvard University Press in 2019, which garnered honorable mention for the International Studies Association's Religion and International Relations Book Prize, and also the author of Faith in Empire, Religion, Politics, and Colonial Role in Senegal, 1880 to 1940, published by Stanford University Press in 2013, which also won the Arthur Andrew Hegel Prize of the French Colonial Historical Society. She has published in Journal of African History, the Journal of Modern History, French Politics, Culture and Society, and French Historical Studies, and is currently co-editing a collection of global scope on decolonization and the remaking of Christianity. She is the recipient of ACLS, NEH, and Fulbright fellowships. And lastly, she is also a friend of the Center for African Studies here at Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Professor Foster to Harvard University.
Thank you so much, Professor Olopona. Thank you for those kind words and for the generous introduction, as well as the invitation to be here. It's such a great honor for me to participate in this event. I want to thank Mrs. Alakija for making it possible. Also, Professor Fauzia and Professor Olopona for the invitation, Dean Hempton, and also all of the wonderful staff at the Harvard Center for African Studies, both in the United States and in South Africa. Thank you all. So as Professor Olopona mentioned, I am a historian of religion and politics in Francophone Africa, with a particular focus on missionary activity and administrative governance in the colonial period, as well as of efforts by Africans and missionaries alike to decolonize Catholicism in the 20th century. As a historian, I'm always a little bit nervous when it comes to interpreting the present in real time. So in what follows, I'm going to offer a response that reflects both on history and also on what Professor Ilasanmi and Professor Olopona have said about the present. So, in a 1953 speech, Leopold Sédar Senghor outlined 3 pillars for the Francophone African future: socialism, federation, and religion. Senghor, a Catholic in a predominantly Muslim country, warned against a loss of faith and rejected the ultra-rationalism of Marxist dogma, even as he embraced his own version of socialism. And I quote, "Already many Africans have lost their souls and don't practice their religion or reduce it to empty gestures of electoral propaganda," he said. For him, this explained the progress of corruption and nepotism in Africa at mid-century. In his mind, however, there was a possibility of an African socialism nurtured by faith, regardless of creed. It was not a question, he said, of mixing up or confounding politics and religion, or of giving them each their separate sphere. Instead, he defined politics as an art of administering the temporal, and simultaneously as active humanism. Because it was these things, he said, and because men could not divide or compartmentalize themselves, it had to be founded on ethics. And as he put it, quote, "Religion remains the most important foundation of ethics," end quote. Senghor's relationship with his own faith is very interesting and often overlooked by the historians and scholars of literature that interpret his writings nowadays. He harbored a personalist conception of Catholicism that proved particularly appealing to African critics of colonialism at mid-century, including a number of clergymen that were among the first Africans to rise to positions of prominence in the Catholic hierarchy. Personalism was an anti-materialist third-way philosophy that celebrated the human person situated in his or her community, simultaneously denouncing the soulless individualism of capitalism and the negation of the individual in Marxist communism. One of the most influential African personalists of the 20th century was Alioune Diop, a Senegalese Muslim convert to Catholicism who founded the influential journal of Negritude, Présence Africaine, as well as the bookstore and the publishing house of the same name. Diop also organized the International Congresses of Black Writers and Artists in Paris in 1956, Rome in 59, and Dakar in 66. And though it has long been overlooked, Diop was a tireless advocate for the idea that the Catholic Church, and Christianity more broadly, should live up to its own creed of universalism and reject its long association with European domination in the colonized world. In his view, it should cease to privilege European culture and values and embrace Africans and African culture. He did not shy away of accusing Europeans of religious racism and ultimately had a great deal of influence on Popes John XXIII and Paul VI. The activism of Diop and others like him helped set the table for an explosion of Catholicism in Africa today by making it more hospitable to Africans. In the 1950s, Senghor saw two processes unfurling simultaneously: a religious renaissance. It was known as the Hour of the Church in Europe, although it's easy to forget that now, since organized religion in Europe has been in free fall since the 1960s. And secondly, a technical disaggregation, that's Senghor's word, of man and his society into atoms, the fruit of rationalism and the unchecked progress of science. In his mind, religion was needed to counter that disaggregation and prevent a slide into what he termed the desert of rationalism. For Senghor, there was no reason to believe that African socialism had to follow a Western, rationalist, Marxist blueprint. He also rejected the idea that the nation state, based on colonial boundaries, should be the natural outcome of decolonization. He hoped for a federal future, one in which his native Senegal would be part of a larger African federation, as well as a political community that combined France and Africa. He feared the balkanization of French Africa into its constituent colonies, which would be poor, underdeveloped, and at a great disadvantage in the world economy. We know, of course, that Senghor's vision of a federation, of polities strengthened by horizontal ties, undergirded by religious ethics, and an African version of a redistributive economy did not come to pass at mid-century. Unable to agree on a federative form, Francophone Africa did split into Balkanized states that struggled for resources. Weak yet brutal colonial states were replaced by weak and often brutal gatekeeper states, to use Frederick Cooper's term, in both Francophone and Anglophone Africa. And I quote Cooper, quote, "Gatekeeper states, like colonial states, were strong at the nodal point where local society meets external economy, dependent on manipulating revenues and patronage possibilities deriving from that point, including foreign aid and commercial deals. They were vulnerable to challenges at that node and afraid of horizontal challenges, such as citizenship, to their vertical power," end quote. Hence the long-standing patterns of military coups in many African states. They were all grabs for that node. Even Senghor compromised himself with strong-arm tactics vis-a-vis his collaborator and rival, Mamadou Dia, though his many admirers tend to leave that part out of his story. Many of France's former colonies became part of so-called France-Afrique, or what Achille Mbembe has termed the reciprocal corruption of French and African elites to enrich themselves and each other at the expense of the people. And what of religion in this post-colonial context? No matter that many heads of state claimed to be religious men, there were frequently no underlying religious ethics obviously undergirding these gatekeeper states. In some places, there was a tacit bargain between religious leaders and the state. For example, in his work on Senegal, Sheikh Babou has argued that Senegal's Sufi leaders made a social contract with the colonial state that continued after independence. They would help provide stability if the state did not interfere too heavily in their affairs. As a Catholic, Senghor welcomed a political alliance with the Marabout since his country was so heavily Muslim. For their part, the Marabout needed to be perceived as separate from the state, but also close enough to influence it. And they played with this ambiguity, exactly as Professor Elissamy has described. Today, Babou argues democratic inroads in Senegal have finally weakened this particular bargain, as has the diffusion of the baraka of some of the most prominent Sufi orders among many candidates for power and leadership. Yet it is no wonder that since many post-colonial states took this gatekeeper form and did not appear to have the underlying ethic that Senghor and others called for, that many African religious communities developed and harbored corrective visions of the res publica, as Professor Elissamy put it. The post-independence weakness of many African states may also help explain the explosion of the so-called industry of religion on the continent. Incidentally, it's interesting to note that missions had in fact done similar things in colonial times in many locales. Though they cooperated with the colonial state, they were also quick to denounce its worst abuses and criticize it for not having a soul. French missionaries in Africa were bitter that their secular state did not heed their advice about, quote unquote, civilizing Africans, a vision which is galling to us today, but at the time reflected both a European superiority complex and a desire to engage with people. To missionary minds, the colonial state cared too much about tax revenue and raw materials for export, not protecting human life or changing people's lives for the better. I now want to circle back to Professor Lasami's closing remarks. He drew a distinction in his talk between a Western liberal outlook, which prioritizes individual rights, and an African worldview, which, quote, sees the self as relational and interdependent. And indeed, Professor Olupona picked up on this in his remarks as well. This part of his talk was what reminded me of Senghor's rhetoric in the first place, and is the reason why I chose to go to Senghor in my response. Because it's a point that Senghor frequently made in his mid-century discussions of negritude, both in cultural contexts and in politics. Senghor was, of course, also schooled in the French tradition, first in a Catholic school, but then in a secular lycée, and he knew all about the French liberal tradition, that Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the foundational document from 1789 that laid it out. When that declaration was issued at the start of the revolution in 1789, France had not yet destroyed the church, attacked the rest of Europe in an offensive war, or killed the king, though tensions between church and state and between the revolution and the monarchy were already visible to all. 6 years later, after a political race to the bottom, which culminated in a frenzy of terror and bloodshed, leaders tried a new formulation in the Constitution of the Year 3 in 1795, which tried to find some kind of middle ground between extremists on both left and right. It is hardly remembered by anyone other than specialists because the regime was quite ineffective and Napoleon did away with it several years later. But it contained an attempt to check the unbridled insistence on the rights of man, which had been proclaimed in 1789. The authors opened the document by listing a declaration of the rights and duties of man and citizen. There were 22 rights, many of which echoed those of the Declaration of 1789, but there were also 9 duties, and I want to quote 2 of them. All duties of man and citizen spring from these 2 principles, graven by nature in every heart. Do not do unto others that which you would not have them do unto you. Do continually for others the good that you would wish to receive from them. And the second one I want to quote is, no one is a good citizen unless he is a good son, good father, good brother, good friend, and good husband. That relational message about man and society got lost in the revolutionary shuffle, while the Declaration of Rights enjoyed a long and celebrated afterlife, reflecting the values that ultimately triumphed in France and indeed in the United States. So if we return to COVID-19, I would argue that it has exposed major failings in the liberal model, which Senghor, Diop, and others had diagnosed in Africa in the 1950s. Indeed, previous public health crises have already laid them bare, though perhaps not to the same degree. In 2003, for example, Europe was hit by a devastating heat wave that lasted for weeks. Some 11,000 elderly people died in France alone, most of them by themselves in their homes. For a society that supposedly has a robust safety net compared to the United States, which continually rejects even the most basic welfare provisions, this was a shocking toll. It revealed the demographic challenge of an aging population, but also the fraying of familial and social bonds. Meanwhile, today in the United States, the virus has ravaged the nursing homes where people have parked their elderly relatives, killing them in droves. This terrible fate of our elders is the product of several factors: longer life expectancies, though not necessarily accompanied by good quality of life, the absurd costs of healthcare and nursing, and our focus on the nuclear family. We have fetishized individual rights and trajectories to the destruction of our extended families and communities. And how does religion fit into that? It's complicated, as Professor Elyssamy suggests. After all, the United States, unlike much of Western Europe at this moment, has robust and flourishing religious institutions that pack halls of worship with millions of believers. Yet many of the regions of the country that are the most devout overlap exactly with the areas where people are more reluctant to wear masks and follow government directives that they perceive as intrusive in their private lives. I think it makes sense to say that here, religious communities often reinforce our deep-seated ethic of individualism. What Professor Elyssamy was talking about and what Senghor was also saying in the 1950s. In our society, sadly, the worst tendencies of liberal individualism seem to have been exacerbated over time. And we insist so much on the separation of church and state that it is hard to see any religious ethic at the basis of our public life these days. Now, if Africa's large and enthusiastic religious communities were to follow Professor Elyssamy's advice and urge compliance with public health messages for the good of all in relational communities, they would lead by example not only in Africa, but in the world at large as the second wave of the virus breaks over us all. The hegemonic powers of the 20th century, whether it's the imperial powers of France and Britain or the Cold War superpowers of the United States and Russia, have all dropped the ball to varying degrees in this pandemic, exposing the weaknesses of their underlying ethics and philosophies. At mid-century, Alain Diop wrote of Africans and Catholicism to the Vatican, quote, "Let us be careful to respect the liberty of peoples. Adherence to Christian values is not imaginable if it does not rest on the liberty to not adhere to Western values." He also complained that Africans had been on the receiving end of missionary teachings for far too long, and that it was their turn to bring their values and their wisdom to the church and the world at large. I agree with Professor Elyssamy that Africans of all faiths could have particularly important wisdom to share at the present moment, both with their governments and a global audience, if it will listen. Thank you.
Professor Olopona, we have time for some Q&A.
So thank you very much. We have sometimes about 15 minutes for question and answer. You have been asked to post your questions, and we will try as much as possible to follow the chat. So if you still have additional questions, kindly post them. And we will give Professor Elyssamy the chance and the opportunity to respond to these questions. I think the best approach would be for me to read them out, summarize them so that we can save time. John Marshall is asking that, is the balkanizing of African ultimately bad? Are Africans not capable of the type of indigenous self-determination seen in Europe, mostly mono-ethnic states? From Tunji Ladigbolu, how much has denial syndrome mindset restrained religious organizations from complying with restrictions on gathering, especially because of fatalities are not recorded like in other lands? And the third question from Monique Akasi. Thank you for highly insightful presentation. I have thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. He's asking us that African religious responses to endemic diseases, epidemics, and pandemics from the past showed a significant difference in the present responses to COVID-19 in a negative, is it in a negative or positive way? He's asking us to look at what transpired or what happened before COVID-19 and then what is transpiring now. Moreover, here in the US, I will be interested in conducting a comparative analysis to today's finding. Well, I think it's just trying to share with us her research project. Deji Okegbile. Thank you, Professor Simeon, for the excellent presentation. Is it possible to link religious high visibility and spiritualized interpretation of COVID-19 in Africa to lack of people's trust and sincerity in the government? And lastly, David Ogungbele, government's inadequate knowledge, insincere response to and corrupt dealings with important national issues and crises seem to be the issue. How would you engage all of these approaches to religious responses in crisis moments? These are the few questions that have been posted, and I'm wondering if Professor Ilesanmi would like to respond to some of them or even all of them. Professor Ilesanmi.
I think the first question has to do with whether or not division or balkanization in Africa is good or bad. My quick response to that is that division is not a good thing. So, and the focus of my talk, especially the last part of it, has to do with what I argued is indigenous worldview, indigenous ethic, which of course a majority of African societies embrace. So it really doesn't, that is not impeded by the political or geographical boundaries or division in Africa. There's a question about denial mindset that seems to be pervading in Africa. I think that's generally a bad thing. In fact, to me, it may also be a sign that those who are demonstrating this denial really lack a sense of responsibility to society, because they know that COVID-19 is indeed very lethal, and they are seeing the effect around them. So to continue to deny is to deny reality. There is, I'm rushing quickly because I know that Mrs. Alakija also has to make her response, and we will be ending at 12 prompt. Maybe I should pause now and allow her to make her remarks. Lot of time. But what do you think?
Wafa, what do we still have some minutes left?
We could go for another maybe 3-4 minutes of the Q&A. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Professor Ilesanmi, continue. We have 3-4 more minutes.
On the comparative approach, this is where Professor Elizabeth Foster will be helpful. I'm not a historian, so perhaps she may have some insights to share with us on that. Let me see another question, just a second.
You want me to weigh in on which, sorry?
Yes, someone had asked if there is some historical perspective you can maybe provide on how societies in the past, especially whether in Africa or here in the US, responded to COVID-19. I mean, to pandemics, not COVID-19, to similar pandemics. Yes.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer to that. I mean, I was comparing, obviously, in the present moment, these major failings we're seeing in Western societies. I know of examples of some epidemic disease in West Africa in the colonial period, that there were actually some similar instincts of kind of apocalyptic interpretations, for example, and distrust of colonial state for sure in those situations. So unfortunately, I don't have great specifics for you, but that I've seen those patterns before in the colonial era.
So permit me, Professor Elisami, to just read some other questions. We may not have the time to respond to all of them, but I think it would be important for us to hear these questions. Kevin Ariema, any comment, please, on recent prophetic statements from religious communities in and regarding Africans' experience and warning about COVID-19? This is from Kevin Ayima. From John Marshall, it appears African religious bodies were mostly pained by their loss of revenue than by the suffering of their members. Should governments require religious bodies to prioritize their spending on member community welfare versus pastor salaries and experience of their branches? Elizabeth Herfong, would you say then that it is both helpful and disruptive then for religious communities to attempt to keep a strong bond with their followers? Would you say then that without them keeping the community bond, they risk not creating a social structure in which to perhaps keep the followers in line with a specific line of thinking? And lastly, from Enoch Badigeshi, thanks for the highly inciting lecture. I quite agree with you on the area of your paper that touched on apocalypse theory. Some popular pastors in Nigeria engaged in a kind of conspiratory theory of apocalypse as a major reason for COVID-19. A pastor even linked COVID-19 to 5G network. What sense can we make of those pastors who have large numbers of elites in their congregation about this conspiratory theory? I think what he's trying to say here is that the elites means the educated elites in their churches. I'm wondering, is it possible for Professor Elisami to say one or two words and then we move to the next section?
Just quickly on whether religious bodies should be using their revenue to cater to the welfare of their members or pay their ministers' salaries, whether government should mandate that. I think that's something that will be very difficult for government to do. It's part of the right to internal self-determination and internal self-governance that religious institutions enjoy. But I suspect that many of them really do not need government to compel them to attend to the welfare of their members before they know that that is their responsibility. The religious institution that is failing in that, I think we need to have to do a serious rethinking on what it stands for. So, but to ask the government to compel them, I think that will generate another uproar of a constitutional kind that the government may not even want to get into. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Fawzi, we're done.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful lecture and responses and a terrific Q&A. Thank you so much again. It's now my honor to introduce Mrs. Folorunsho Alakija, who generously endowed this lecture series, and she will provide some closing remarks. Mrs. Alakija is a dynamic businesswoman and a philanthropist with a sincere desire to help the needy. She is the vice chairman of FAMFA Oil Limited, which is a successful oil exploration and production business, and also oversees her philanthropic endeavors, such as the Rose of Sharon Foundation, which empowers widows, their families, as well as orphans through educational programs and scholarships. Mrs. Alakija is a member of the Harvard Center for African Studies African Advisory Board, and for that we are really grateful. More recently, she participated in our COVID-19 and Africa webinar series, where she shared her reflections on the impact of COVID-19 on the Africa workforce situation. She's been a steady supporter of the center, and we're so delighted that she's able to be with us today and share some closing remarks. Over to you, Mrs. Alakija.
Professor Wafai Fawzi, Interim Oppenheim Faculty Director, Harvard University Center for African Studies, Professor Simeon Ilesanmi, Washington M. Wingate Professor of Religion, Wake Forest University, members of the Harvard faculty, members of the advisory board and council members, all visiting faculty members from other universities, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure and honor to give the closing remark at the second edition of the Folorunsho Alakija Lecture on Religion and Public Life in Africa. It was supposed to be a physical meeting, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic and its attendant health issues, we have had to go virtual. However, I am happy to say that the quality of the unaffected. I thank the keynote speaker in the person of Professor Simeon Ilesanmi for his lecture on the legal regulation of faith, the limits of religious freedom, and the challenge of COVID-19 in Africa. I also thank Professor Jacob Olupono, Professor of African and African American Studies, Harvard University, and Professor Elizabeth Foster, Associate Professor of History at Tufts University, for their insightful contributions during the moderated session. We must continue conversations on this topic, even after this meeting, because this is still an ongoing reality in Africa and all over the world. This is as a result of the second wave of the virus, which has caused restrictions to be imposed on movements in most European countries and the United Kingdom. On how this endowment all began, I remember that conversations on hosting this lecture series started in 2017, when I met Professor Emmanuel Ayampong for the first time in Nigeria. He's a pastor as well as a professor, and we both share the desire to understand the role religion plays in society. This is an endeavor that requires partnership of faith practitioners and those who study them, and an understanding of how states regulate religion in the public sphere. So, considering Harvard's religious origins and its distinguished record as a center of learning for almost 400 years, I could not think of a better platform than an endowed lecture on religion and public life. Now, let me expatiate on the practice of religion and faith that has been challenged during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa and Nigeria in particular. The advent of the coronavirus in 2019 has altered the way we live, interact, and socialize. This virus that was initially detected in Wuhan, China, spread rapidly to other parts of the world and was subsequently declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization on 30th January 2020. In its spread, including Africa, each government adopted measures to curb its inflow in their countries. In Nigeria, the federal government rolled out sets of guidelines to prevent this spread in our country. These protocols include: 1, lockdowns; 2, imposing the wearing of face masks in public, plus frequent hand washing and/or sanitizing; 3, stay-at-home orders and curfews; 4, closure of schools; 5, closure of all land borders and airports; 6, institution of social distancing and restriction of public social and religious gatherings. The latter varied in the number of persons from state to state, between 20 and 50 people. The COVID-19 pandemic tested the patience of some religious leaders across Africa, who worried about the spiritual welfare of their followers as restrictions on numbers of worshippers continue. In order to mitigate this challenge, some of the religious denominations, which had earlier included digital technology in transmitting their services, have resorted to full live stream of their worship services. Some have also developed home cell worship services, splitting their members into smaller units, while others split their worship services across numerous buildings, parking lots, and fields at various intervals, whilst maintaining social distancing protocols. However, some other congregations which had not embraced technology or who have very large congregations suspended their gatherings altogether and enjoined their members to worship at home. Several religious ministers who defied the government's restrictions on social distancing protocols were arrested by security agents. Though the restrictive measures were initially embraced by the majority of religious groups, however, following the extension of the restrictions, some religious leaders who were earlier silent on the government measures added their voices to the criticism of the restrictions. They argued that the masses need both physical and spiritual food to survive the pandemic. These criticisms were partly responsible for the decision of some state governors to relax religious restrictions in Nigeria for the Easter celebrations. So, how can we think optimistically about the practice of religion and faith going forward, despite the challenging times we find ourselves in. The COVID-19 pandemic that has swept across the world does not seem to be going away anytime soon. Although the number of infections and fatalities across Africa remain relatively low in comparison to the Western world, there is a need for us to remain vigilant as there are concerns that the continent is not yet out of the woods. A 2018 study by the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan American think tank in Washington, D.C., concluded that the overall levels of religious commitment in sub-Saharan Africa are among the highest in the world, as the region's number of Christians grew from about 7 million in 1900 to 470 million by 2010. According to Reverend Charles Odorokami, an emeritus bishop in Uganda, he said, Africans are notoriously religious. Christopher Behuhanga, a professor of systematic and historical theology at Uganda Christian University, further declared that we Africans want to live in a community, and the coronavirus is now redefining that community. Christians strongly associate their faith with the brick and mortar buildings of their parishes, and coming together to worship is part of the accountability that guides trust as people share their testimonies. There is also the general belief that though people can pray at home, however, for some, congregational prayer is very powerful. Hence, the desire for congregational worship. The Bible also says, where two or more are gathered in my name, where two or more are gathered in my name, two or more are gathered in my name, suggests physical gatherings are needed. They are required. They're important to Christendom. And I know that the Bible also refers to Jesus having ministered to multitudes. For others, their only source of emotional, psychological, and financial support is from the members of their congregation, and staying away from them will impact their well-being negatively, which could lead to a crisis of their faith. Therefore, in responding to the pandemic, governments should not overlook the volatility of religion, as it has the potential to either promote or impede the public good. Hence, government and religious leaders must come together and agree on modalities of how people can meet physically, whilst ensuring that all safety protocols are adhered to, thereby preventing the risk of transmission of the virus. This option will be a win-win solution as the goals of both parties are achieved. As I conclude, I thank all the speakers at today's lecture and all those who have contributed in one way or the other to ensure the success of today's program. I also thank all our participants. I trust that it has been a fruitful one for each and every one of us. And I look forward to next year's lecture, which hopefully will be a physical gathering. Thank you for listening. God bless you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mrs. Alakija. This is wonderful. Really appreciate your closing remarks, your sentiments, and your shared words of wisdom. We are also very grateful for your continuous support of the Center for African Studies through your input as we gathered in the advisory group and your insights on the various activities we do, and for endowing this lecture series. So thank you so much. Clearly, the topic of religion and public life has been a growing important topic within our society as the global pandemic has forced us to rethink the role that faith plays in our lives and has challenged our abilities to practice within our communities of faith and here at Harvard. As a public health professional myself, I found really the lecture and the responses to be quite illuminating. It's a wonderful coming together of various disciplines that sometimes are looked at separately, from public health to law to politics, and of course, a central element of religion. It was fascinating to sort of think about sort of the balancing act that Professor Elesami has urged us to consider between human rights of individuals and the potential for meeting safely, if possible, as Mrs. Al-Akija has noted, with the other side of human duty and responsibility, and how to contextualize the limits of this balance and the limits of freedom using language that communities understand, as Professor Olopona has shared. There are many lessons that we can learn from the pandemic and from the current experience, and thinking back about the experiences of other instances that have faced the continent. And these lessons will certainly be useful as we face future challenges in the times to come. In addition to this annual lecture series hosted by our center, we are grateful to our partners at the Weatherhead Center for their support of the research cluster on religion in public life in Africa and the African diaspora. We're really grateful for Dean Hempton and the faculty at Harvard Divinity School for embarking on their first new master's program in 50 years on the topic of religion and public life. I'd like to thank the audience and the staff for their contributions to this conversation. It has been a wonderful opportunity to engage virtually. And I do hope, as Mrs. Al-Akija noted, that next year, the 2021 Folorunsho Al-Akija Distinguished Lecture on Religion and Public Life in Africa will be in person, and we certainly look forward to that. I would like to conclude by thanking again our keynote speaker, Professor Elesami, Dean David Hempton, Professors Olopona, and Professor Foster, and really a pleasure to have Professor Elizabeth Foster, who is part of our Boston community, participate in this, and we look forward to more of these linkages across our two institutions. Finally, many thanks to Mrs. Al-Akija. We definitely extend our debt of gratitude to you for endowing this important series. At the Center for African Studies, we continue to host our weekly webinar series on Africa and COVID-19 in partnership with the Africa CDC. Next week, on the 18th of November, we will have a session on meeting the challenges of higher education in Africa. More information on that webinar and our series on our website, africa.harvard.edu. Thank you again, everybody. I wish you all the best and that you stay safe and healthy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.